Hey y'all, how are you doing? I'm great. Thank you so much for asking. It's me, Kim, and I'm back for another video. I've been having these conversations about institutional racism, about prison, policing, government, public policy. But I thought, because of some things that I've seen, that it will be useful for us to have a conversation about the connection between Christianity and white supremacy. Because if you really want to know why so many white Americans make the political choices that they do, that's it. So I decided to reach out to Jemar Tisby. Jemar is a writer, a minister, a historian. He wrote a book called The Color of Compromise, The Truth About the American Church's Complicity in Racism, which was so good. It taught me so much. It's now a New York Times bestseller. Shout out to him. We talked about white evangelicals and their long history of racism, why that is Donald Trump's base, and that explains why he's out here with Bibles and in churches when you know he doesn't believe in God, he doesn't care about the Bible, but those are his people. We also talked about why so many young Black people are moving away from the Christianity that we were taught, and why he's chosen to stay. Now, two things. This conversation is about racism, but I realized that you can't really have a conversation about Christianity without actually talking about gender identity, and sexuality. I missed it. I had questions about it written. I just didn't get to them. So that's my bad. And two, the internet, it was just not perfect. Now, it wasn't bad. It wasn't the worst, but not perfect. Like a 7, an 8. It's still watchable, still a great conversation. Here it is. All right. So, hi, Jemar. I wanted to talk to you because last week, Pastor Lamar Giglio, I think that's how you pronounce it. He's the pastor of Giglio. Yep. He's the pastor of Passion City Church in Atlanta. He was in conversation with Dan Cathy, who is the CEO of Chick-fil-A, a little controversial, and gospel artist Lecrae. And he said,
Lecrae, it's interesting because I feel like on the inside of the church, we're fighting this historical context you talk about. In other words, we love the blessing of the cross, but we don't love to sit in it and realize this is what God's asking me to do, to die to myself and to live for him, whatever context that's going to look like for me. But I want to flip that upside down because I think the other side of it is true with our nation's history. We understand the curse that was slavery, white people do, and we say that was bad, but we miss the blessing of slavery, that it actually built up the framework for the world that white people live in and lived in. And so a lot of people call this white privilege. And when you say those two words, it just is like a fuse goes off for a lot of white people because they don't want somebody telling them to check their privilege. And so I know that you and I both have struggled in these days with, hey, if the phrase is the trip up, let's get over the phrase and let's get down to the heart. Sure. Let's get down to what then do you want to call it? And I think maybe a great thing for me is to call it white blessing.
I was quite shocked and appalled by that. Seems like he was trying to whitewash slavery. This is a man who was a spiritual leader to thousands of people, and that's his analysis. That is a little concerning. He came back and apologized, but what did you think of that moment?
So it happens so often in these conversations, not even just in a spiritual setting, but in general, where these conversations about race and racial justice tend to be bounded by what people perceive as the most fragile white person. And so what Giglio was talking about there is that using the term white privilege was triggering for a lot of white people. And so I think what he was trying to do was find language that would invite them into a conversation instead of having them stiff arm it. But in doing so, he stumbled into this phrase, white blessing, which is extremely damaging, very theologically off, and quite frankly, insulting to think of slavery and the products thereof as a blessing, which gives this sort of divine approval of the whole enterprise, of the whole institution and what came of it. So that's what I think people were responding to. I mean, it was trending on Twitter. It made national news, and rightly so.
Yeah. So I'll also be honest, I don't love the optics of two middle-aged white men bringing in 30-something Black men to have him guide them through this moment. It just felt a little tone deaf. It felt a little off to me.
Yeah. From what I understand, Bernice King, the youngest daughter of MLK, was supposed to have also been at that event, but she had a health issue the night before, and so she couldn't make it. So I think they were looking for the dynamics to be a bit different than what they ended up being.
Okay.
But I understand. So that's a factor. But Lecrae is a friend. He wrote the foreword to my book, The Color of Compromise. And
I saw that.
I know what this brother has been through. Yeah. And, it's so difficult to be in that position. See, as many Black people and many other people of color, we want to be part of the solution. We want to help. And that doesn't mean, being doormats. It doesn't mean always being at the beck and call of white people, but especially at a moment like this, where there's actually sustained national attention and there's the potential for real movement and change. You want to be in those conversations, especially with folks who have platforms like Giglio, like Dan Cathy, and hopefully be helpful. But oftentimes, it can go sideways so quickly.
Yeah. So this entire controversy was a reminder for me that very few white churches or churches led by white people are speaking to this historical moment, meaning the kind of reckoning that we're having with race in a meaningful way. Why do you think that is?
So it's interesting. I think there has been movement since, let's say, 2015 and the Black Lives Matter uprisings. And so in 2015, Black people and Black Christians were talking to other white Christians like saying, are you going to say something? Are you going to speak up? Are you going to do anything but respond with all lives matter or blue lives matter, right? So that's the conversation we're having 5 years ago. Now in 2020, a lot more white Christians who are leaders with prominent platforms are taking an initiative to at least say something. Now, the effects of their statements, the long-term changes, all of that remains to be seen. But a slight change is that, folks are taking initiative. You can look, for example, at J.D. Greear, who is the current president of the Southern Baptist Convention, which was founded as a pro-slavery denomination in 1845. And he comes out with a video saying several times, Black Lives Matter, which for a guy in his position, this is the largest Protestant denomination in the country, that's a big deal. It's not a big deal to us, but that's a big deal for him. So there has been movement. But
did he get any backlash for that? I mean, what was the response after he did that?
Yeah, so J.D. Greear is in his mid-40s. He kind of represents a generational divide in the SBC, but also an ideological one. And so there is a segment of the SBC, and I'm talking specifically pastors here, who are on board with him. And, they're showing up even at marches and protests in this current iteration of the Black freedom struggle. But there's also a very vocal contingent that is staunchly against it. And one of the things I'm looking for in the Christian church, particularly the white Christian church in the US, is there going to be a white lash as a result of this? As we're seeing more white evangelicals talking about this, participating in demonstrations, is there going to be some type of pull back to a racial status quo that they're familiar to in the next year or so? I think that's something to look out for.
Oh, okay. This is interesting because I did read your book, and there have been other times where there have been some racial schisms within these organizations, but we'll get to that later. Okay. So I wanted to talk about, because that was so interesting to me, but I wanted to talk about how at the beginning of this month, or maybe the end of May, I don't know, time is moving in a weird way. I don't know. Donald Trump, when people were taken to the streets because of the incidences of police brutality across this country, Donald Trump, who we know don't really have no religion, he made it a point to pose at a church with a Bible and, cleared out St. John's, had the police use tear gas and everything. Why do you think that he made it a point to have that kind of display of religiosity at that moment?
Donald Trump is hemorrhaging support, even among his staunchest allies, white evangelical Christians. And so I think that was a photo op, a sacrilegious photo op, I would say, in order to shore up his bona fides with white evangelical Christians, especially in this moment. So he's grossly mishandled the pandemic to the detriment of thousands of lives. And in this moment of extreme racial unrest and racial tension in this national conversation, he is so ill-equipped to handle the conversation. And he's so ill-equipped to handle it that even his longtime supporters are seeing it and saying, I don't know about this guy. Now, it took 3.5 years for them to get here, but I think that photo op was a way of him trying to enforce, hey, I'm your guy. You'll never have a better ally in the White House than I am for what he conceives of as Christianity.
Yeah. And that has to be a part of why he would choose Mike Pence as a running mate or Mike Pence as his vice president, right? To really appeal to those white evangelicals.
Precisely. I mean, you couldn't get a better poster child than Mike Pence, middle America. He speaks the language of evangelicalism. And that was absolutely, I think, a strategic move on Trump's part to try to get that white evangelical vote. But I think as we're talking about this sort of brand of religiosity, I find sociologists have had some really helpful things to say. And so two sociologists, Samuel Perry and Andrew Whitehead, came out with a book recently called Taking America Back for God. And what they talk about at length in their book is this idea of white Christian nationalism. And I think that's a more accurate descriptor of who Trump is trying to appeal to. And so white Christian nationalism is this blend of race and nationalism couched in this veneer of Christianity and Christian language. And I can give you one historical example that sort of illustrates the brand of religion this is. Many people don't realize that the KKK had 3 different iterations. One was right after the Civil War. The third one was during the Civil Rights Movement when Black people were making gains. And then the second one, and in many ways the most widespread and violent one, was during the Jim Crow era in 1915. So on Thanksgiving Day in 1915, a former white Methodist circuit preacher, so he's a preacher, he gets a group of his white buddies. They go to the top of Stone Mountain, Georgia, which has Confederate figures on the front of it. On top of it, they burn a cross, which becomes infamous in Jim Crow and the Civil Rights era. But they do something else. They build an altar, and on that altar, they place 2 objects, a Bible and an American flag. And so this is a ceremony that has all kinds of religious overtones, even Christian overtones, with the cross and the altar and the Bible. But it's this brand of nationalism that basically says this is a white man's country. And that's how white Christian nationalism codes itself. To be American is to be white. To be American is to be Christian. To be a true white person. And on the top of this racial pyramid is to be Christian and nationalist. And so we see this manifesting in various different ways on up to the present day.
That's so interesting and pretty appalling. So when people see these white evangelicals in the White House actively and enthusiastically supporting the president and his racist policies, his xenophobic policies, people are like, how could you support this racist man? Like, is that what Jesus would want? How are you a Christian? But like you said, white evangelicals have a long history of supporting racism in support of the American project. And that goes back even like before the Civil War, right?
That's right. Just for a contemporary commentary, there's another brand new book out, just came out, called Jesus and John Wayne. And it's by a historian named Kristen Kobes-Dumez, D-U-M-E-Z. And she is tackling this question that you just posed. Like many people after the 2016 election, when we saw that 81% of white evangelicals who voted pulled the lever for Trump. And a lot of us were like, how can they do that? This goes against everything they say they stand for. What she's arguing in Jesus and John Wayne is that actually Trump is the fulfillment of everything they say they stand for, in the sense that in particularly the 20th century, what developed as white evangelical Christianity, a strain of it was this sort of quote unquote muscular Christianity. It was very masculine, very patriarchal, very tough guy. One of Trump's evangelical cabinet was quoted as saying, "We want the toughest guy we can. We want the toughest SOB that we can see in office." And so in many ways, it was the fulfillment of that wish that they saw in Donald Trump, this kind of strongman figure who would aggressively make space for white evangelicals and their point of view in contemporary culture. And so that's 20th, 21st century. But as you say, the history is much longer. And I can, attest to that through various different events.
Yeah. So like I mentioned, I loved the way that you went through the history in this book. So let's go back to the kind of the racial split. So I had no clue until I read The Color of Compromise that major denominations of Christianity in the United States split over slavery in the 19th century. Could you talk a little bit about those schisms?
Yes. So the three biggest denominations in the 19th century were the Methodists, the Baptists, and the Presbyterians, and all three split over the issue of slavery. And so the Methodists they split over whether one could be a slaveholder and still be in good standing. Specifically, I think it was a bishop that they were talking about. And then what really gets me is the Baptists, who I mentioned before, they split over the issue of whether a missionary could be a slaveholder and a Christian in good standing. And what gets me about that is they were commissioning this white man to go spread the gospel, probably in countries full of black and brown people. Meanwhile, in the US, he thinks black people are property. And so the contradiction there is just stunning, but an entire denomination split over it. And the SBC, the southern part, is the fact that they were Southern and pro-slavery at their roots. Now, they officially repented of their pro-slavery roots in 1995, but obviously there's still a legacy of that foundation. The Presbyterians, too, split shortly after the Civil War began, mainly over what it was a proposal at their national meeting that if you want to be a Presbyterian, you had to say you were going to support the Union. And then, of course, Southern Presbyterians were like, oh, no way. And not only did they split off from the national Presbyterian body, but they became, they were already pro-slavery and pro-Confederacy. And so those schisms reverberate on into the present day with the very uphill climb that we have to go to achieve any sort of racial justice or racial understanding within these predominantly white denominations.
Yeah. And if we're talking about how inextricably linked these racist ideas are in our government, I did not know that Woodrow Wilson's father was a Presbyterian minister who was quite racist. I had no idea.
Right. Yeah, that was one of the revelations that I had early on in this research, is that Woodrow Wilson, president of the United States during World War I, he was a preacher's kid. And the Presbyterian church, which I just mentioned, they held their first meeting at his father's church in Augusta, Georgia. And the first meeting of this new denomination, it was called the Presbyterian Church of the Confederate States of America. And so they were pro-Confederacy, pro-slavery, all the way down. And of course, Woodrow Wilson, when he becomes president, he institutes segregation in the U.S. government.
Racist. Yes.
Notoriously racist. There were actually changes being made that he halted. And then he also was the first president to show a movie in the White House. And of course, that movie was Birth of a Nation, which was racist propaganda about the supposedly noble founding of the Ku Klux Klan and taking the South back for the white man and to preserve white female purity from the rapacious black man and from these northern carpetbaggers. And so that's the film he showed. And he said it was like writing history with lightning. He loved it.
Yeah. All right. So I also learned in this book about spirituality of the church doctrine.
Yeah.
Never heard of it before. Super fascinating. Could you talk a little bit about that and how the adoption of that view fuels complicity in racism?
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up. So spirituality of the church is a fancy name that white clergy and theologians give to this idea of the separation of church and state. And so on paper, what the spirituality of the church says is that the church is fundamentally a spiritual institution. It's not supposed to be out making laws. It's not supposed to be out, lobbying for various different political policies or whatever it might be. And in the most generous reading, it's designed to keep the church from being a tool of partisanship. But in practice, what happened was the spirituality of the church doctrine became an excuse for white Christians, and in particular Presbyterians, not to engage in the issue of abolition or emancipation or ongoing issues related to segregation and racial equality. And so one of the things that we have to know, spirituality of the church can go by a lot of different names, but the principle is pretty consistent across denominations historically, that when it came to issues of race, all of a sudden those issues were too political. Those issues were civil issues and the church couldn't get involved. But it's very selective, because when it came to other issues, from prohibition to prayer in schools, to Bible in schools, to abortion, white Christians were all too eager to get involved on a policy level. So it's just interesting where they draw the line and on what issues as being too political or not.
Right. And I guess it also lays bare, we are laying that the connections are really obvious between white American Christianity and a kind of nationalism that seeks to marginalize people of color, that seeks to ostracize. And even if you are not wittingly, people try to kind of feign oh, I'm not racist, but your silence, right, is complicity. And then you talked about
That's right.
How many white Christians participate in a complicit Christianity. What does that mean?
Yes, that's a central component of the book. It's called The Color of Compromise and the Truth About American Church's Complicity and Racism. And I thank you for asking that question, because it gives me an opportunity to unpack that a bit. A lot of people will look at those terms, compromise and complicity, and say, well, that's not strong enough. If you look at the way Christians actively promoted racism, actively promoted white supremacy, they were in many ways at the forefront of creating and maintaining this system. And I say to that, absolutely yes. And there are some very overt racists and white supremacists out there, the people who put on white robes and hoods, they burn crosses, they hold the noose for the lynch mob, etc. But what that does is it says, well, racism only manifests itself in these extremes. And so if I'm not out, lynching someone, if I'm not out burning a cross, if I'm not out using a racial epithet, then I'm not a racist and I'm not part of the problem. Well, the issue with that is it absolves so many people. And the reality is the most egregious acts of racism, the most egregious acts of racial terrorism, like the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing where 4 little girls are killed, that can only happen within a context of compromise. Mm-hmm. And so what I try to get at in the book is the silence, the apathy, the lack of action, the acts of omission as well as commission are part of what it means to be racist in this society, is that you're not doing something or you're not speaking up about something is tacitly giving approval or opportunity for these more egregious acts of racism to occur. And throughout the history of white Christianity in the United States, unfortunately, you see a pattern of compromise and complicity rather than courageous confrontation.
Yeah. And everybody loves Martin Luther King now, right? But he was a quite controversial figure in his time, as those of us who read know. And, you're talking about the white moderate that Martin Luther King was talking about in his letter from Birmingham jail in 1963. So there are a bunch of white moderates now. What do we need them to do? Do we need them to get off the sidelines? Do we need them to speak up? Do we need them to leave their churches? What do we expect?
Yeah. Ooh, all of the above. So I devote the last chapter of the book to sort of practical solutions and practical ways to help. And before I get into, specific actions of what I think Christians in general and white Christians in particular can do, I just want to explain the framework that I use. So in that chapter, I unpack a model that I've been developing called the Arc of Racial Justice. And it's an acronym that stands for awareness, relationships, commitment. And what I'm concerned about is that we have a very sort of imbalanced approach to racial justice. And so right now you're seeing all these book lists, all these resource lists out there. I think that's great. We need to inform ourselves, and that's building awareness. But if that's all you do, then that's not going to move the needle on racial justice. And so what the Arc of Racial Justice does is helps us have a more holistic approach to this issue. And so building awareness is what we're just talking about. It's this video. It's learning more about history, learning more about the sociology and the psychology of racism, learning more about how race operates. And that's valuable, but we need to go further. We need also relational aspects to it. And so in the Christian frame, all reconciliation is relational. It happens between people. It's not about statistics on a page. It's not about numbers. It's about actual human beings and seeing the image of God in every single man, woman, and child on the planet. And it's through that some of these issues of racism become real for people, especially for white people. I mean, you can give them an article, you can give them a book, but unless they actually know somebody who's struggling because of racism, it's likely not to make a difference. But then a lot of folks like to stop at relationships. And they say, oh, you know what? Some of my best friends are Black. I'm not racist. I'm good. No, actually, that's not enough, because all of your little cups of coffee at Starbucks aren't going to do anything about the racial wealth gap. All of your pulpit swaps at the church aren't going to do anything about mass incarceration. And so the commitment aspect gets to the idea that policies and practices can be racist in and of themselves because they exacerbate or create racial inequality. And we need to work on a policy level too. And so I propose that framework, the Arc of Racial Justice, to help us keep all of those aspects in tension. But here's the thing. This wave of protests and uprisings is going to end. It always does. This level of activity is not sustainable for most people. I'm looking for two things. Number one, I'm looking for the remnant of people who are catalyzed for a lifetime because of this moment. It is a turning point in their life, and they're going to become lifelong racial justice advocates. This is going to be across the racial and ethnic spectrum. We're looking at our Asian brothers and sisters, Latin American folks, even white folks coming into this movement. And it's never going to be a majority of people, but it doesn't take a majority of people to cause major change. And so I'm looking for that remnant. Who's going to stick around after this wave? The second thing I'm looking for, if you're not going to be the one who completely sort of shifts your disposition and takes on racial justice as your life's work, okay, but give us money. Write the check. Ongoing financial support to fuel this movement. And a lot of people denigrate, money because it seems so worldly, because it seems like such a easy thing to do to sign a check instead of actually getting involved in activism. I'm cool with it because we need money. and we want this work to keep going forward. If all you can do is write a check, then write that check.
Yeah. So I appreciate that model, and I appreciate the steps, like the actionable items that you've laid out. But it does seem to me like the foundations of white Christianity in this country are inextricably linked to white supremacy. And it's like, if the foundation is bad, like the whole thing gonna be bad. So I'm really curious about if it's truly possible to extricate racism and white supremacy from the Christianity that most white folks are plugged into, like truly eradicate it.
Yeah. So I don't believe in utopias on this side of heaven. And so I'm not looking for perfection per se, completely eradicate racism. I am looking for progress. I am looking for, basic human dignity, which is the least we can ask, right? But you're right. So from the foundations, historically, for hundreds of years, Christianity in this country has been connected to whiteness, white supremacy, and racism. And so the question is, can it be redeemed? Can it be reformed, or whatever? I don't think in its present form it can. I think what we have to do is a couple of things. Number one, remember that Christianity is a global religion. And so we have a lot to learn from the majority world in the way Christianity is practiced by people in Kenya and Nigeria and Mexico and the Philippines and Korea, and where the majority of Christians reside. Because they don't have the same historical baggage with race-based chattel slavery. They've got their other stuff, but we have a lot to learn from them. But even in this country, white Christians need to divest themselves from whiteness, and that's going to be a very difficult project because they benefit from whiteness. But they need to acknowledge that it exists, study the history, repent, repair. And I think that is going to be aided by learning from the Black church tradition, which claims the same Christ, but has a very different approach to race, very different approach to justice. One of the things that the white Christian needs to learn is that they tend to begin in the New Testament and with the resurrection of Jesus. So it's this sort of triumphal good news message, and that's part of it. But a lot of Black Christians begin in the Old Testament with the Exodus narrative.
Right.
They begin in shackles and they get liberated by the God who cares, the God who says at the beginning of the 10 Commandments, I am the Lord, your God, who brought you out of Egypt. You shall have no other gods before me. And that paradigm as a starting point leads us in very different directions in terms of race and justice. So the white church is going to have to sit at the feet of the Black church, if you will, and of the majority world church in order to learn how not to be white Christian nationalist and just call it Christianity.
Yeah. So I personally have taken a step back from attending church. I was deeply, deeply religious for most of my life. But I do know that when I choose to go back to church, I would choose to go back to a Black church. And I've always loved that about church. It was just a space for like a celebration of a specific kind of Blackness that means a lot to me. But we are right now seeing the rise of multicultural churches. And I wonder what's fueling that, and what are the consequences for Black churchgoers?
Wonderful, very timely question. Yes, we have seen a sort of flowering of multiracial churches, multi-ethnic churches in the past 20 years especially. I think what's fueling that is a couple of things. One is just simple demographics. I mean, we are living in the most racially and ethnically diverse nation on the planet, and it's becoming more so. And the younger generations are already close to majority minority already. And so some of it is just kind of this demographic mixing and people getting together. Some of it is a concerted effort on the part of churches to be multiracial. And so there's some things like the Mosaics Network, which started in Little Rock, Arkansas, with the intentional focus of bringing people of different races and ethnicities together in a vision from the Bible of Revelation 5:9, Revelation 7:9. It says people from every tribe, tongue, and nation are going to be worshiping around the throne in heaven. And so they want to say, well, if we're praying thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, then our congregations should mirror that heavenly assembly in terms of diversity. So some of that's happening. There's a big racial reconciliation movement that started in the 1990s, and it was characterized by things like the Promise Keepers movement that's had a bit of an impact on the growth of multiracial churches. But the scholarship out there says that even in these multiracial churches, they tend to be culturally white.
Yeah.
And this goes back to a point we made at the top of the show that, racial justice efforts, the pace tends to be dictated by the fragility of white people. And so churches that are attempting to be multiracial, they may make good attempts, but they're always thinking about how are the white people going to respond? And white folks tend to be newer to the conversation, tend to move slower on this journey. And so it hampers the ability to be truly multicultural and inclusive. And so I think a lot of people are frustrated with some parts of the multiracial church movement. There are some churches that are doing it well, I'm sure, but it's harder to pull off than just getting different people with different skin colors in the same room. There's so much more to it, and it's so much harder to dismantle the sort of ingrained white supremacy and white cultural norms than most people expect.
Yeah. Yeah, so you mentioned in the book how some Black Christians have used the Bible. I mean, this is pretty well known. Some Black Christians have used the Bible and progressive theology, liberation theology. Shout out to James Cone for progressive aims like anti-racism. We, of course, have womanist theology, but there's also a very deep strain of conservatism in Black churches that they find to be biblically rooted. So, as a Black person with lots of very religious community members and family members, what do we do about that?
Yeah. I think we need to honor our elders, right? Because what they've gone through in many ways is a lot worse than we have, and they have been in the struggle and pushing. I think we also need to understand that Black Christianity is not monolithic by any means. Mm-hmm. So Black liberation theology of the James Cone variety stands as a very academic expression of Black theology, and is relatively new in that sense, in that he came out with his first book in the late 1960s. And so as an academic discipline, he's really paved the way for Black Christianity and Black liberation theology in particular to be a legitimate discipline in the academy. So we're indebted to him and the many, many others who came after him. You mentioned womanism and womanist theology. I am learning so much from people like Shaniqua Walker Barnes and her book, I Bring the Voices of My People, as she's talking about evangelicalism and the racial reconciliation movement. So we have tons to learn there. I think we also need to look at history, right? Like Fannie Lou Hamer is one of my heroes, but she grew up in a rural Black Baptist tradition. You might even call her fundamentalist. But she was able to understand her faith in such a way that it led her to really courageous and bold stands for racial justice, Black civil rights, voting rights. I think we need to look at people like her to say, well, how was she understanding the faith? And to say, actually, this is part of our historic heritage and tradition. It's a tradition of activism. It's a tradition of progressivism on social issues and moving the needle forward. So what we have to do is get beyond, even within Black Christianity, this idea of a monolithic Black Christianity and say, okay, well, you were raised in this tradition or stream of Black Christianity. Let's look at some others. And let's say that there's room here for change and for growth and for learning from other people who came before us, did some things right and did some things wrong.
Yeah. So church and Christianity in particular has long had a very important role in the lives of Black communities in the United States. But we are seeing over the past 10, 15 years, younger Black Americans are shifting away from that. We are much less likely to say that we are religious. We are much less likely to attend church regularly. Do you think the era of widespread, deeply rooted Black religiosity is over for good?
Great question. So I think the reasons for this sort of generational movement away from the institutional church are many. Number one, it mirrors the overall pattern. So this is not something that's unique to Black people in this country. It's happening with every racial and ethnic group. So there's that to pay attention to. In addition, it's also good to note that even as younger generations move away from the institutional church, Black people as a whole still identify as the most Christian demographic group in the US. And so in comparison to these other groups, we're still very Christian, very religious. But more to your point, I think what we're seeing is a widespread distrust of any sort of institutions and any sort of hierarchical power. And this has been happening for, several decades now, but you see the lack of trust in historic institutions like the church, but also like governments, like corporations. Anything that smacks of sort of hegemonic power is suspect, and with good reason. We've seen so much homophobia, sexism, financial mismanagement, all of these things in all of these institutions and all of these leaders we were supposed to trust. So what are you supposed to do? Just say, oh, well, shrug your shoulders and keep going with it. What I would say to young people is, instead of sort of doing away with institutions altogether, create new ones, form new ones, and learn from the mistakes that you've seen in other ones. So, the alternative to leaving church or religion completely is to start new churches and new denominations and new fellowships. That's on the table too. So I would caution against just thinking in terms of these binary terms where you're either in or you're out, and there's nothing in between.
Yeah. I will say something I've always been frustrated with, even as I figure out my own religious stuff, is the accusation that Black people who are still Christian and do still invest themselves in those kinds of religious institutions, that they are brainwashed, that this is a white people's religion. You mentioned earlier that white Christianity and Black Christianity are not the same, despite the fact that we worshiped together for a long time in the antebellum period. So like, how do we move away from the narrative that if you do choose to be a religious Black person, a Christian Black person, that you are inadvertently or wittingly working in support of white supremacy?
Yeah, so that idea that Christianity is the white man's religion has a long history. There's a great book out by, I'm blanking on his name, but it's called Black Free Thinkers. And he's talking about atheists and non-Christians, particularly in the 20th century, who had a big influence on things like the Harlem Renaissance or the Civil Rights Movement. And so that history is there. And there are a lot of Black people who rejected Christianity because it was seen as the white man's religion. Muhammad Ali, he has a very memorable conversion story, and he remembers being handed like a political cartoon that showed a white Christian whipping a Black slave. And he's like, why am I going to be part of, he was raised as a Christian, but he's like, why am I going to adopt this religion that's done nothing for my people? So I understand that sentiment. But I would say two things. Number one, look at the Black church tradition, right? Somehow Black Christians were able to see through the white supremacy that was proffered by white Christians and see a liberatory message in the gospel of Jesus Christ. They knew that their situation was similar in some ways to the Hebrews who were enslaved in Egypt. They knew that God is on the side of the oppressed. They knew that in Matthew 25, when Jesus says, what you so did for the least of these, my brothers, you did for me, that in some sense he was talking about them. And so they knew that God's eye was on the sparrow, and they used their faith as a source of wisdom, as a source of inspiration, and even as a source of political and social change. The other thing I would point to is that the Christianity long predates the political entity known as the United States and any modern concept of whiteness as we know it. And the fact that Christianity was in what we call the Middle East long before it was in Europe. Christianity was in parts of Africa long before it was in Europe. And so in many ways, we have bequeathed a faith from people of color to people who are white and European. They got it from us, in a sense. And so to say that Christianity is the white man's religion is myopic in two senses. It's myopic geographically and it's myopic chronologically. And I would just point to the bigger story of Christianity to say, well, it's been used as a white man's religion in this context, but let's look at it in some other context too.
Yeah. I think Black folks generally, especially Black Americans, understand what it means to remix things, to recontextualize things, to make our own institutions and our own traditions. I do think people are a little myopic when it comes to Christianity, but that's whatever. I wanted to go back because there was something I wanted to mention. So often when we talk about evangelicals and Christianity and white Christian nationalism, people like to focus on the South because of some regional biases, and people think the South is the hotbed of racism or whatever. But I really did appreciate you outlining how white churches in the North were also complicit or actively participated in racism. So can we talk a little bit about that, how Northern churches fueled white supremacy in this country?
Thank you. Thank you for bringing that up. It's such a crucial point that I devote an entire chapter just to talking about complicity in the North. And by the North, I mean anywhere else but the South. And so, yes, there is this illusory, erroneous perception that the worst place for racism is the South. I grew up in the Chicagoland area, and I moved to the Mississippi Delta in my early 20s to be a teacher. And I've been here my entire adult life, except for a short stint in Jackson, Mississippi. And I can tell you there's racism everywhere. And in some senses, the racism in the South it's a lot more obvious. It's a lot clearer, places you can go, places you're not supposed to go, the history, the traditions. And so that makes it easier to navigate in some ways. I grew up in a context where people really thought, we were post-racial, right? Like they thought, well, because we see different people, then we don't have a problem with race. When the reality is our schools were still segregated, our churches were still segregated, the racial and economic inequality was just as big or bigger. And that has a long, long history. And so if you look at, Red Summer in 1919, they called them race riots. They were really white race riots against Black people. But they're cropping up in places like Los Angeles and St. Louis and Detroit and cities in Ohio and on the East Coast. So it was by no means confined to the South. The Catholic Church has had major struggles with racism. They're interesting because they operate on a parish model, which says, they have one church for a geographical area, and they're supposed to serve whoever's in that geographical area. But in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and then in different waves in the 20th century, you have this huge shifting of populations where it goes from European immigrants who are coded as white in the United States to Black and Latino populations. And now these churches, they're not going to move, but they have a totally different constituency. And they really struggle with that and do some outright blatant racist things in the midst of that. Matthew J. Kressler is a scholar who works on Black Catholics, who's done some really great work on them in the 20th century, as well as others. So it's by no means confined to the South. One thing I'll say may be different about the South is the physicality of race and slavery. And so I go to graduate school at the University of Mississippi. My commute is literally through cotton fields. Yeah. Now, that's not something I ever saw growing up in the Chicagoland area. And some of the Civil War battle sites are here. I can go visit the site of Emmett Till's lynching. So the geography is different here, which makes it seem more apparent than it is in other places. But as even now we're seeing with Confederate monuments coming down, they're all over the country and not just in the South.
Yeah. I also thought it was interesting and useful to think about how white churches participate in white flight, divestment from inner cities, yes. Urban areas, yes. By moving their churches outward. Yeah. Yeah.
So I mentioned the Catholic Church. They're unique because of their parish model. They can't just up and move their churches. They place them strategically in geographic areas to cover a wide region. Evangelical churches and Protestant churches have no such restraints. And so many churches, including a church I used to attend, it was a multiracial church, but before that was predominantly white. And as the quote unquote demographics were changing, which is code for it's becoming a black mm-hmm. neighborhood, they're predominantly white parishioners who all lived in the suburbs and the church was in the city. They voted to move the church to the suburbs. And of course they said, well, it's going to be more convenient for our members. Most of our people live out here. But what was happening was the church was just chasing the suburban white flight that was already happening. And so that happened all over the country, is that, you have these churches popping up in suburbs and exurbs. They have these sprawling campuses and their populations are almost entirely white because the white people have left the city, left the inner city. Of course, now some of that's reversing through gentrification, but that's a whole other story.
Yeah. It's cyclical. Okay. So we mentioned how a lot of the big denominations of white churches or like white-led denominations, that they split because of slavery. Do you think that it is their responsibility to pay some sort of reparations or to have some kind of financial investment in the Black communities that have been negatively affected by their work, by their theology?
Absolutely, I do. And this strikes very close to home because I run a Black Christian nonprofit. And I've been doing this since 2011. And to this day, we struggle raising money because we are Black focused. There are ways we could sort of tap dance and get more money, but we would have to sort of soften or change our message. And we're just not willing to compromise on that. And then you look at white churches and white Christian ministries and white nonprofits that literally have multi-million-dollar budgets, staffs of dozens or even hundreds of people. And you're like, what is happening here? We are no less talented. We are no less passionate. And yet the financial resources aren't there. And that has a long history. It has a history to do with racism in the church, but it has the history of racism in society in general and tracing it back to the racial wealth gap. And so I think, as Martin Luther King Jr. said, the church should be the headlight, but too often it's the tail light in society. Mm-hmm. And I think the church ought to be the headlight on reparations, where you have many white Christians waiting around for the federal government to do something, which may or may not ever happen. In the meantime, why don't you take action yourself? Why don't you take action? There are all these bivocational pastors who can't afford to be on staff full time because their constituents don't have any money. Pay their salaries, pay off the mortgages of these Black churches that are doing the work in the inner city that you're either not willing to do or you want to do in a sort of gentrified manner. Help the people who already know the community and are there to support it. Help Black-led Christian ministries like the Jude 3 Project, like Build a Better Us, like Be the Bridge, and to have financial solvency so that they can do their work that they're already doing very effectively, but not be hampered by a budget that's too small to actually fulfill the ministry that they're trying to do. And so absolutely, I think reparations are due. I think financial support is due. And I think Christians should be leading the way and not waiting for a secular government or some other sector of society to set the example to make it what all the cool kids do and then jump on board the bandwagon at the very end.
Yeah. So finally, you mentioned something I do think is really interesting. There is a belief, I think, that people are really skeptical because they see the megachurch pastors who have Bentleys and like the huge churches and huge homes and private jets and all of that. But like most pastors, most ministries, most churches are not flooded with money. Like they are, a lot of people are really, really struggling. So could you talk a bit about like the disparity between some of the most visible ministers that we see versus what's really happening with churches in most communities?
Yes, great point. We'll see the president's evangelical council, and for the most part, these folks are what some would label prosperity preachers, and they're basically preaching, if you donate to this church or this fellowship, God is going to bless you with more financial blessings. And of course, that's not what the Bible teaches. You'll also see some prominent Black pastors who are living very well and asking for private jets and whatnot. But just mega churches in general are a minuscule proportion of the entire churches in the United States, in like the single digit percentage, I believe. And so it's a very skewed vision if that's all that you have. A majority of pastors, and I know a lot of pastors and Christian leaders, men and women, Black, white, Latino, Asian, all over the racial and ethnic spectrum, they are trying to love their congregation well. They're trying to shepherd them through something like a pandemic and people getting sick and dying and losing jobs. They're trying to be attentive to their own families and their own families' needs. Pastors do so much. Like, it's way more than just preaching on Sunday. I do most of the preaching at my church, and I'm in the church building, middle of the week, mopping up water from a leaky roof after a rainstorm, right? Calling the exterminators so we can get, another spraying. working with the cable company so that we can get more bandwidth so we can do these darn sermons online because we can't meet in person. That's the day-to-day of most pastors. And so I would hope that people who only see, what's on the headlines or what's in the news, and that's your perception, you can do a Google search of churches in your area and pick any random church and get a very different picture of what ministry is actually like.
Yeah. Do you think a lot of churches are not going to be able to recover from the pandemic?
That's what the data show, and Black churches in particular. I mentioned before, a lot of Black church leaders are bivocational, meaning they work a full-time job and then they do pastoring on the side because they don't have enough money to do pastoring full-time. We're often serving populations that are historically impoverished and dealing with generational poverty. And so, when you got a congregation full of quote unquote essential workers who all make below a living wage and they get laid off, it's hard to bounce back from that. On top of that, you have a bunch of smaller churches. We talked about mega churches, which are churches over 2,000, I believe, is the technical definition. Most churches are far less than 100, maybe 80 people, maybe 50 people, maybe less than that. I live in a rural area. A lot of churches are just family churches. It's your family and extended family, and it might be 12, 15 people on a Sunday. And so those are the kind of churches that are going to be hardest hit, not only from the financial aspect, but from the pandemic aspect. When you've got older Black folks, when you've got Black folks who don't have health care, when you got Black folks who are working in the meatpacking industry or the healthcare industry and they're at high risk, we're going to see a lot more deaths. We already are seeing a lot more deaths, and it's going to hit us financially even harder. So this is, just more incentive, more reason for wealthier churches, especially wealthier white churches, to come alongside and do some form of repair and reparations to financially support the churches that are being most adversely impacted in this season of a pandemic and a recession.
Okay, so this is my final question. All right. So I know that you got saved when you were 16.
Yes.
And I am wondering, because we are seeing such a generational shift in the way that young Black folks approach religion and Christianity, despite the fact that we are more religious than white folks, what keeps you connected to Christianity? Why did you want to dedicate your life to this calling?
I found an Exodus community. And so there's this great article by Campbell Robertson in the New York Times called A Quiet Exodus. And it talks about Black people in the wake of the 2016 presidential election leaving their predominantly white Christian churches. And his story was about the leaving part. My story is about the wilderness wandering. And so if you go back to the story of the Exodus, after they cross the Red Sea, after they're freed from Pharaoh's slavery, they spend 40 years wandering in the desert. That's a very difficult 40 years. But what they had was God and each other. And that's what I found. After I had made a bit of an exodus from the predominantly white Christian circles I was part of, I found a group. I found a remnant. It's not a big group, but it's a faithful group. They're mostly Black people, but they're from all over the racial and ethnic spectrum who get it about racial justice, who want to be part of the solution, and who are allies and advocates along with me in this. And they're the ones who give me strength. They're the ones who help remind me of God's presence and God's reality when I'm tempted to despair. And so I've got several text message groups and group messages, and we're sending dozens of messages a day. Like, you won't believe what this white person just did, or, I'm having a rough day. It's your community, it's your squad that helps you get through. And I think that's the way God designed it. The church is far more than what happens on Sunday morning. The church is the people of God. And what I found is a whole new people of God once I made that exodus from a white supremacist kind of Christianity. And that's one of the main things that keeps me going.
Well, thank you so much for taking some time to talk to me, Jemar. I really appreciate it. Thank you guys so much for watching. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Read Jemar's book. Check out his work. Leave a comment down below. Shout out to the patrons. Shout out to the members. I appreciate y'all so freaking much. Sign up for the email newsletter. Buy some merch. You guys, if you live in the United States, our coronavirus numbers are going up because nobody is social distancing. We're not wearing masks. Please People are dying. It does not have to be this way. So let's all be as conscientious as we can. Thank you. I will see you next time. Bye.